The Pediatric Lounge, a podcast taking you behind the door of the physician's lounge to get a deeper insight into just what docs are talking about today. From the clinically profound to the wonderfully routine and everything in between.
Welcome to the Pediatric Lounge. This week we have the pleasure of hosting Dr. Andrew Gardner, a pediatrician in Cleveland, Ohio. He holds a PhD in neuroscience and a degree in psychology. He's also written extensively, including a book on child development and the American Academy of Pediatrics guidelines on ACEs. It's a pleasure to host him today and talk about the limbic system and the effect that adverse child events have on development. Please help us welcome him today. Hello there, George. How are you today?
Pretty good. It's Friday evening tonight, and today we have another fascinating guest who's going to speak to us about some fascinating information that not many people know about.
Welcome, Dr. Gardner. It's such a pleasure and a joy, and so grateful that you could join us today, especially with your background in pediatrics and neuroscience and what you have done in the academy, as well as a book you've written.
Thanks for having me. It's great to talk to you guys.
I'm a pediatrician, so I'm kind of interested in how you went through the journey of neuroscience into pediatrics and into a primary care pediatric office.
Sure. Well, I was always interested in the brain, I think. So when I was actually as an undergrad, I did a psychobiology major. So I told everyone I was a psychotic biologist. So I was really interested in how that interface between the biology and the mind. And so when I finished my undergrad, then I went into medical school, but I wanted to learn more about the brain. So I did an MD PhD program. So I got about as reductionistic as you can get, looking at genes that were important for the development of the brain. And then when I finished my PhD, I thought originally I was going to actually do pediatric oncology, because some of the genes that I were working on were oncogenes, genes that could be used that are commonly found in tumors. So I went to residency, and about halfway through residency, when it's time to start applying for fellowships, my wife was like, "We need to talk," because at that point, I had a child who didn't know who I was, and so my original plan actually was just to go into primary care for a couple of years. It turns out I love doing primary care. I mean, I love the fact that it's always an opportunity to educate, that it's never the same thing. I mean, if you would ask me in medical school why I would have do primary care, I would have said there's no way, because how many ear infections can you see? But each ear infection is different, because you have to explain what's going on to family and their background. And so I love the educational piece of primary care. And so I pretty much just stayed. But I think that that PhD part of me, even though it was 25 years ago, has stuck with me in the sense that I tend to see child development as the overt manifestation of brain development. And so I've always been fascinated about what we can do with the environment to optimize, and what is it about the environment that tends to hold kids back. And so that's sort of been the arc of my career, really, is looking at those factors in the environment that seem to promote child development, and the factors in the environment that seem to hold kids back.
Let me tell you, in pediatrics, ear infections are no longer. After they started giving the Prevnar, I have medical students that rotate with me.
Yeah.
When I have an ear infection, it's a treat for them because they don't see it.
Well, it's true. Science moves forward, and I think that's reflected in the nature of pediatric practice too, right? I mean, I think that that's part of the problem, is that primary care pediatrics in particular is really a strength-based thing. We are trying to get things right the first time, and we are pretty much embedded in a healthcare insurance industrial complex that's absolutely deficit-based, right? I mean, the whole system, every visit actually gets boiled down to two codes, a diagnosis code, which basically says what's wrong with you, and a procedural code that says what we did to you, right? So that's pretty much a deficits-based framework. And it doesn't really allow for the richness of what we can do when we have strong relationships with our families and patients. And so you're right. I mean, things have changed a lot. That doesn't mean that I still don't, I'm still not happy seeing the ear infection, because that's something I can fix. I can do something for. That's something I can fix. But yeah, things have definitely changed, no question.
My favorite diagnosis is nursemaid's elbow.
Absolutely.
Oh my
Instant
goodness.
gratification.
Instant gratification. And the grandmother thinks you're the hero.
Yeah.
She's going to marry you off to her single daughter and buy you a new car.
I haven't quite had that experience yet, but I look forward to it.
It's such a celebration.
It is. No, you're right. It's immediate gratification, but I think that reflects a lot of our society, right? I mean, a lot of our society is immediate gratification. And I think that's part of the problem, is that we're always thinking about here and now, this budget, this election cycle. We're really not thinking long-term and thinking developmentally. And I think that's part of what we're up against as pediatricians, is getting people to realize, again, that what happens in childhood doesn't stay in childhood. You know what I mean? And that we can do things right in childhood and have tremendous returns of investment decades later, or we can continue to find new and creative ways to mess up kids, and then we pay for it for decades.
That's right. So I'm going to really pick your brain on the PhD in neuroscience, basically because my education as a physician in neuroscience was your liver can always regenerate. As a matter of fact, we can cut half your liver, put it in another human being. Your liver will grow, and your liver will grow in the other human being to be a full functional liver too. But your brain and your lungs, you're done at 7. Whatever's there, it is.
Right. So let me again say, my PhD was 25 years ago. So things have changed a little bit. And one of the major things is what you just sort of alluded to there, is the idea that there's no new neural generation in the brain. That used to be dogma, right? That, once you reach a certain age, there's no neurogenesis, there's no making of new neurons. And that's actually not true. Turns out that the vast majority of neurogenesis does happen in utero. So that's all true. We got that right. But in certain structures in the brain, like the hippocampus and the prefrontal cortex, which are important for memory and learning, there actually is ongoing neurogenesis throughout life. And there are things that we know that promote that and things that diminish that. And not surprisingly, stress prevents that, right? And so that's why it probably is true that, if you've had a stressful experiences over a course of life, you probably have a harder time learning, because you probably don't have as many neurons to work with. And so that's just one example of how science changes. But yeah, I mean, I think that I can sort of give you my little spiel about how I think about brain development, if that'd be useful. But I'm happy to answer questions too.
So that was one concept that's radically changed,
Yeah.
Either through cognitive therapy, maybe through some drugs, some serotonin drugs, exposure therapy, and now these virtual reality therapies that they have. You can change the pathways and the way your brain functions, not just to alleviate pain, but to actually function at a normal, healthy, well-being level. And that's very important.
Well, it's actually pretty complicated, because it turns out that, we talk about plasticity and how the brain changes, right? There's actually two kinds of plasticity. There's synaptic plasticity. So you've got two neurons talking to each other. You can turn up the volume between the two of them. So those two neurons can sort of whisper each other, they can scream at each other. And that's lifelong, which is good news. So an old dog like me, I can keep learning new tricks, right? Okay. But then there's cellular plasticity, and that's way more powerful. And that happens particularly in early childhood, but it sort of seems to stop as you get older, which is the ability to form new connections between neurons. So that's cellular plasticity. So that's way more powerful. So the way I liken it is, synaptic plasticity has got this one connection, and it can whisper at another cell, or it can scream at another cell. But cellular plasticity is like going from one person screaming to a whole stadium screaming, right? So it's way more powerful. But that cellular plasticity declines dramatically over time. right? And that's the problem, is that as we get older and as our brain matures and as all those connections get wrapped in fat, which is myelin, which speeds up transmission, it speeds things up, but it then also limits the abilities for new connections. And so that's one of the main principles of brain development is, that over time, you can still make changes, but it requires way more effort. So you got to try and get things right the first time if you can.
Correct. And then just because of all the increase in mental illness we're seeing in children, I think it's important for our audience to go back to the anatomy and physiology, because I think it's changed quite a bit. And what we understand about it today seems to be a lot more than we did when I was in medical school in the late 80s. Basically, our therapy was electrical shock therapy, lithium, and tricyclics. And you still saw people with catatonic depressions in the psych ward in the corner of the room. And we really didn't know why it happened, but it happened. And we were like, dear, I don't know. Let's just let's do, electroconvulsive therapy, see if we can get him out of there. So it seems to me from what I read and I've seen you talk about that the amygdala and the axis, which of the amygdala is part of, is extremely important to our memory, our feelings, and our stress response. And this I find fascinating, and I kind of want your insight onto it. The lateral nucleus of the amygdala, and this was very interesting, is in a book. It said, if I point to my ear and I point to my eye, the intersection is right where my amygdala is. And the lateral one is supposedly what translates memories into feelings. So if a dog barks at me when I'm a 6-month-old and I'm scared, that feeling of scared when I hear a barking dog is stored as a feeling memory by the lateral amygdala. And that's where we find the instant response to a lot of stress. And then we have the prefrontal lobe, right? Which doesn't really, and I was going to ask you, is it at 25 or 27 or 30 that the prefrontal lobe finally has full judgment, which stops some of this response?
So I think these are great questions. I'll answer them as best I can on my 25-year knowledge for going back. But I think the principle is that, well, first of all, it's real in any neuroscience worth of salt. It's going to tell you got to be really careful when we try assigning functions to specific structures, because the brain is so integrated, it's sort of inextricably interdependent upon each other, that it's really hard to say this is what's doing that, right? And so you get into trouble when you say too much. Now, that being said, you're right. The amygdala as a structure, in a simplistic way, I think of it as the on switch for the stress response, right? So it is impulsive, it is subcortical, it's not something you're thinking about. It's the part that protects you without even knowing it's protecting you. So if you are, walking in the woods and you jump, and then you realize, oh no, that was just a stick. I thought it was a snake. That was your amygdala. It didn't even get to your cortex. It just was a reflexive, keeping you safe type of thing. And so, and you're right, in terms of memories, we think there's sort of two different kinds of memories. There's implicit memories, which are sort of emotional memories, and there are explicit memories where we remember details. And that actually is an important thing in pediatrics too. So if you think back to the first explicit memory you can remember, like a detailed, like where like I was here, I was wearing this, someone was here, and someone said that, it's usually like 4 or 5. And less than that, we think kids have implicit memories. So when that 15, 18-month-old comes in and starts screaming, right, and we're thinking, oh, they remember the shot, it probably isn't they remember a shot. It's more of a deja vu. It's an emotional memory, like something bad happened here. It's just really not cool, which is why you see them wigging out, because it's an emotional memory. It's a very strong thing. So yeah, explicit memories versus implicit memories are really important. But I think the simplistic way, at least I tend to think about it, is that the amygdala is there to keep you safe. The prefrontal cortex is the part of your brain that they sometimes call the executive, the sort of, it's where executive function lives. So it's sort of the they sometimes say the air traffic control of the brain. It helps you decide what's important to prioritize. It has working memory. And some people even said it's the seat of civilization, right? It's our prefrontal cortex that allows us to be civilized and interact with each other. But the point you're trying to get at, though, I think, is that these two things I sort of think almost as being two sides of a seesaw, because we know that the prefrontal cortex can shut down the amygdala, and we know the amygdala can shut down the prefrontal cortex, right? The problem, though, is that you already alluded to it, they grow at different rates, right? So the amygdala matures structurally. So again, looking at the structure of the amygdala and how it's myelinated and what it looks like, it's structurally mature pretty early in development, which sort of makes sense. You want to shoot first, ask questions later, or they may not be tomorrow when you're young, right? So it makes sense. On the other hand, that prefrontal cortex, that part that allows you to do the executive functioning and planning, that's not structurally mature until 24, 25, right? So there's a long time during development there where the on switch for the stress response can be screaming and twitches and just screams at you, and that prefrontal cortex is just still finding its voice. And you see that all the time in adolescence, right? So when they're cool, calm, and collected, they can come up with brilliant ideas and brilliant thoughts, and like, wow, that was impressive, right? But if emotion gets involved, not so clear anymore. That's true for all of us, really. So that's the challenge, is that the on switch is screaming through a lot of child development, particularly there's adversity. And then the prefrontal cortex, which has helped turn off that stress response, is still sort of finding its groove, which is why relationships are so incredibly important. And that's what the latest, AAP policy statement was getting at, is this idea of relational health, right? The fact that when you have safe, stable, nurturing relationships, when you have those caregivers, there literally is this thing called biobehavioral synchrony, which is just really, really cool. The idea that we sort of connect with each other on an emotional level, and even an autonomic nervous system level, our heart rates and breathing patterns and EEG patterns will sync. That's sort of the magic stuff we sort of have experienced when we say we're in sync with someone. We were really in sync. We connected. That's what we're all looking for. And it turns out it's almost like that's a bug in our biological code that allows parents and caregivers to modulate their child's stress, right? Because the emotions connect. And so if you've got caregivers that are cool, calm, and collected, the child's going to calm too. And once they calm, then you can engage that prefrontal cortex and actually build skills. And I think that's the really take-home message here, is that when you're young and your brain's still developing, are we locking in those pathways for fear? Are we locking in those pathways being impulsive and aggressive and looking out for number one, or do we provide those safe, stable, and nurturing relationships that allow us to get beyond that and actually begin using the thinking, learning, and creative brain?
Absolutely. And so my very little understanding of neuroscience is the amygdala will drive the hypothalamus to then produce all these stress hormones, such as cortisol, epinephrine, and your heart rate goes up, you breathe faster, you sweat. And cortisol is very damaging to not only your brain, but your ability to, your glucose metabolism, your ability to sleep, your ability to regenerate. And I think that's what you're alluding to, that a child that is under a lot of stress as he or she's developing will end up with chronic diseases that cost a lot of money to treat as adults, such as cancer, obesity, cardiovascular disease.
They certainly can. And I think we have to be careful to say that there are strong associations between childhood adversity and poor outcomes down the line, but that doesn't mean it's destiny. So we have to be very careful that we're not labeling kids for the adversity they've experienced. But you're right. I mean, in terms of the anatomy, once the amygdala says, whoa, there's a problem here, the amygdala is identifying there's a threat. There are actually sort of 4 different pathways that get activated. The most primitive is actually through the the periaqueductal gray, which is a lower part of the brainstem there, where basically it's the freeze response, right? And so, it's the deer in the headlight response. And that's sort of thought to be evolutionarily the most primitive response, is when there's a fear thing, just freeze. And then there's a pathway from like you said, from the amygdala to the hypothalamus, and particularly the anterior hypothalamus. And then we have sort of two pathways. They're the sympathetic medullary adrenal pathway, and then also the adrenal I'm sort of messing that up there, sorry.
Yes.
But the bottom line is they both trigger the fight and flight response, right? And that's the second sort of. So you got freeze, you got flight or flight, where you got the catecholamines coming out from the amygdala, from the oh boy, I'm really having trouble here. The catecholamines are coming out from the adrenal gland, but then you also have cortisol coming from the adrenal gland as well. And so they work on different time frames, but catecholamines and cortisol, even though they work on different time scores, are basically making us ready for fight or flight. And then the last one that we don't talk about a lot, but is really important, and this is actually only in higher primates, we think, is there's an affiliate pathway too. So you got freeze, flight or flight, or tend and befriend is the other one. And so it turns out the amygdala also activates the posterior hypothalamus, which allows the secretion of oxytocin. So this is really interesting, right? So oxytocin is a hormone that's intended to, we think, actually increases social saliency. If that's the simplest way of thinking about it.
The bonding hormone.
Bonding hormone, exactly. And so it has some complicated effects, though. So if you are stressed, you may want to tend and befriend. So tend infants, the bonding like you're talking about, but you may also befriend others so that we can gang up on a common enemy, right? So I mean, the reason we're here, we weren't necessarily the fastest or the strongest animals out there, but we could act socially, right? And so that's really important, because the question then is, how do we try and regulate what pathways the amygdala is activating? What in any circumstance, is it freeze, is it flight or flight, or is it tend and befriend, right? And if we can understand that, that's really an important understanding.
Great, that's a wonderful explanation. So I was going to talk to you about oxytocin, because supposedly it's the first. Well, and I don't know if I could say it's the first, but the importance of having that baby on the mom's breast right after birth is because all that oxytocin gets released, both in the mom and the baby, and it creates an opportunity for that nurturing relationship to start. Interestingly enough, if the father is in the room, they also seem to have somewhat of a similar effect. So that bonding hormone effect at such an early moment of life seems fascinating.
Oh, it is. And what's really fascinating is how the brains of new parents change. So we've always known that the brains of new moms change, and there were hormone things that were going on. We thought that was but dad's brains change too, like you're mentioning. And the thing that's really neat is that the circuits that seem to change are the ones that, again, that are in the reward circuit and the social recognition circuit. The idea being that now social interacting with the child, ooga ooga ba ba ba, and smiling at the child is actually so incredibly rewarding. It is almost like a drug, right? And so we've always known the kids' brains were programmed to connect. Turns out parental brains are programmed to connect as well. And it just underlies the importance of those early relationships.
Yes. And then there's the dopaminergic system, which is your reward system, right? And that one doesn't have much to do with anything else other than impulse. As far as relationships,
well, I think it's again, it gets complicated because the reward circuit also is involved with addictions, right?
Yes.
And so I think we need to remember. So the ventral tegmentum is an area that's thought to be important for reward, but it also is a part, and the nucleus accumbens. These are dopaminergic pathways. They're also really important for cravings, right, and for rewards and addictions. And I think this is an important thing to keep in mind, because there's this concept, in physiology, we talk about homeostasis, the idea that that there are certain things that need to maintain at a certain level. So our oxygen level, our sodium level needs to be at a certain level, or bad things happen. That's homeostasis. Allostasis is the active body's response to get back into homeostasis when it gets pushed. So again, if you get hot, your body's going to start sweating, and if your sodium gets too low, we're going to be looking for water. And so there are behaviors we do to get back. So this idea of behavioral allostasis, particularly with stress, though, there are behaviors we do that turn off stress that can be very adaptive in the short term, but really health harming in the long term. And those are the addictions we're talking about, right? So people smoke and juul and eat too much and have promiscuity for a reason, because in the short term, there's a burst of dopamine, there's a burst of joy, but in the long run, they become health harming. In fact, one of the really insightful participants in the ACE studies, the Adverse Childhood Experiences study, is one of these studies that we alluded to earlier, where there's strong associations between adversity and childhood and outcomes down the line. One of the participants said, doc, it's really hard to get enough of something that almost works. Right? Yeah. So it's really easy to get addicted to those things that almost works, whether it's smoking or promiscuity or otherwise. And so I think, yes, the reward pathway, and that's another example I was saying before, the brain's so interconnected, it's really hard. It's really hard to parse it apart. I actually think of the brain more as like, and particularly brain development, as being like playing the game of solitaire, right? If you don't have all the aces, you're gonna have a hard time winning, you know what I mean? And so it's really interconnected there. Yeah.
It's very complicated. The brain's very complicated. And then there's the serotonin and norepinephrine circuits, which, we know a little bit from depression. And I was just fascinated. I didn't know this came from the dorsal raphe nucleus. That's the serotogenic center. And I was talking to Dan. He said the key factor or the key thing about depression is you get locked, you get trapped into a thought of, I can't do anything. And until the prefrontal lobe, which is not developed in most of our patients, can see hope that they can escape that, and that circuit between the prefrontal and the raphe nucleus gets activated, you can't get out of the depression. So when he explained it like that, I was like, oh my goodness, this makes it so much more difficult, because the adolescent is not yet fully developed to help me get that going.
Well, yeah. And I think that message of you're stuck is one that sometimes we inadvertently send to patients. Do you know what I mean? I mean,
Yes.
If you have a kid who's struggled, and I don't mean just we, I also mean as parents, right? I mean, if you've got a kid who's struggled, you can sort of see when they've given up, I've given up, and that, I think, is probably the most dangerous thing that I see in my practice. When I sense there's no more of a growth mindset, I'm scared.
Lots of hope.
Loss of hope, loss of growth, loss that I can change, loss that I can, like I said, that synaptic plasticity is lifelong. You know what I mean? Yeah.
Yes.
So, yeah. And so you're right. I mean, I think hope is a critical part of it. And kids see themselves the way we see them, you know what I mean? And sort of self-fulfilling prophecy. And so if we're saying, you're broken, you've had adversity, you've done all these things, and it's the same thing all over again, and you're never going to change, and you're good for nothing. What else? What other voice do they have inside their head to listen to other than that? You know what I mean? And so, yeah. And so I think that's our challenge, is to always, and this sort of goes with pediatrics in general, is to always be strengths-based, to always be hopeful, to always be, and there's good data out there. They sometimes call it the common factors approach in terms of therapy, right? The common factors approach are really the relationship that you have with the family. And one of the things is being optimistic, and being hopeful. So yeah, there's no question. Hope's a major part of what we need to do, and to help break that cycle of negativity. In fact, that's one of the things they talk about is the ants, right? With anxiety, the automatic negative thoughts that kids have, yeah. And how can we try and turn off those ants?
And so I'm going to step back just for a second on the dopamine. I don't know where it plays this, but we do know from research that when people fall in love, in the infatuation phase, they're basically an OCD patient on steroids, and there must be
But it
something.
feels good.
Oh
It
yeah, it
feels
feels
good,
good
right?
until you get
Right.
dumped. um, but there must be some that must go through somewhere the dopamine, the reward center.
Oh,
You know,
absolutely. Yeah.
because falling in love is like an addiction. But I do also remember seeing my son being born and falling immediately in love. Like it was such a weird feeling that here's this, you know, you and I and George have been in the delivery room hundreds or thousands of times, and we go through the routine, dry the baby, do the APGARs, you know, check for any deformities. And I was just like, so it must have some role in that, you know, the reward center must have some role. Um,
Oh, no, just no question. Yeah.
so it's very interesting how it's all so interconnected. Um, Now you've done a lot of work with ACEs, and there's some screening, and we put them on our website, the ACEs screening. And I wanted to ask you, when do you think a pediatric practice should be doing the ACE screening? Like, should we do it 5 times in a lifetime, or when should we do that?
Well, I have to be honest with you. I mean, I think the ACEs are important to understand because they help us understand again what happens in childhood doesn't stay in childhood, and it's sort of an overt manifestation of what toxic stress, that ongoing exposure, does to you. But I think we have to be careful about ACEs screening, and I know that sounds sort of counterintuitive, but there are a couple things. First of all, the ACE study and the ACEs are actually a relatively poor measure of adversity. And the reason I say that is that the original ACE study was done retrospectively, and we know people tend to not want to recall adverse experiences, right? And so there's issues to recall. There's issues with repetition. So, you know, if you've been sexually assaulted once or every day for a month, you still just sort of get 1 point on the ACE score, right?
Right.
And there's also issues with redundancy. So if your dad was addicted to marijuana and your mom preferred heroin, that's still 1 point, you know. And so an ACE score is actually a really poor measure for adversity. And we know there are many other adversities that are also associated with poor outcomes down the line, like exposure to racism, right, and violence in your neighborhood, and that sort of thing. And so I think my concern with the ACE score per se is that it can easily become just another label we have for those kids, and I think
Okay.
that's a problem, right? That being said, is it important for us to understand the adversities that our families are facing both now and in the past? Absolutely, right? And so these are things we want to know, and we want to help parents understand how perhaps their adversity in childhood is impacting the way they're parenting now. So I think, to answer your question specifically, in my practice, we use the Kemper-Kelleher pediatric intake form, which is something that is in Bright Futures, and it asks some questions about the parents, their experience growing up. And it doesn't really give you an ACE score, but it allows you to have those sort of discussions about what happened to the parents as a child, and what is it that they want to make sure they do like their parents did, and what is it in retrospect they want to make sure they never repeat. And that's an opportunity to have a real good discussion about parenting and discipline and what they want for the kids and what they don't want for the kids. And it's an opportunity for us to join in with the parents. And so now we're on the same team, and there's no shame associated with it. There's no labeling. And so I know that's a long-winded answer,
No,
but
no,
I think it's important to see the pros and cons. I mean, I think particularly when you're starting in practice, having, and I think it's true for any screening, even an MCHAT or an Edinburgh or a SCARED or any screens you may use in your practice, that's really just a tool to have a discussion, right? I mean, I don't think the score is nearly as important to me. And I know that there are epidemiologists and researchers that are losing their minds when I say this, but from a clinical perspective, I'm way more concerned about the conversation that I can have because of that, as opposed to what that actual score says.
yes. And you do a lot of these tests, and they're normal, and you know, but you know, you're trying to pick out the one that's not, that for some reason it went under your radar, and so
Well, you're
that's
right.
utility.
Yeah, it is. But I think that points out an important thing though, is that if we're screening for developmental milestones, that may be one thing. Because it's sort of objective, can they do this or they can't do that. When you're talking about an ACE score, that's way more personal, and it really is a disclosure, right? I mean, a developmental screen, we both can observe whether it's happening or not. It's an objective thing. Asking parents about their past experiences or not has to happen in a safe space. It has to happen within the context of a relationship in order for them to be honest. And so it's really about setting the stage for a disclosure, as opposed to check, 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 check. And I think that's the problem, is we've gotten so check happy.
Right.
We've forgotten that if we don't actually have a therapeutic relationship with the family, that's not going to make much of a difference. So please hear me. I think it's important that we identify sources of adversity. We meet families where they are. And if an ACE score helps you do that, then go for it. But I think that that we have to remember that if we do an ACE score and it just gets filed in the chart and it's never acknowledge that the family disclosed to you something, now we've even alienated the family even more. Well, that was the first time I ever told someone that, and they didn't even make a comment. We made things even worse. So I think we have to be careful about how we use those tools.
I would also think that I think this has happened to me. Sometimes you don't do the ACE score, but you look at the family dynamics and you see a repetition pattern. You see 10, 20 families that act the same way. You walk into the room, it reeks of smoke. There's a young mom, there's no male, and grandma's there, but grandma is only 16 years older than mom. And it's real hard to catch yourself from just going, oh, yeah, well, I'm not going to waste more time here because this is going to keep repeating till I'm dead. That I think is one of the other minefields or traps of the ACE score, that you might become very desensitized and lose yourself as a provider, as a therapeutic person, the hope. And that's
I think I don't think there's any question we have to be careful about implicit bias. You know what I mean? That's a bias we're going to have, and we have to acknowledge we have those. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And the only way to counteract it is to be aware of it. And you're right. I mean, that was my concern, is that I'm really careful that that we are not just coming up with a new and creative way of labeling those kids, right? That shouldn't be what it's about. And this is the most important thing about ACEs. It's only half the story. It's only half the story. It's only the adverse childhood experiences. And we now know that positive childhood experiences, those early relationships, those magical moments, they also play a role in predicting outcomes down the line, not only because they buffer that toxic stress event, they literally turn off the stress response, but those relationships are also the building blocks for building skills, for actually helping kids to learn and to grow, that growth mindset we're talking about, and actually helping them learn how to adapt adversity in a healthy manner. So yeah, I mean, I think that's the most important thing about ACEs, is that if we're only looking at deficit, we're falling back into our medical model. We're falling back into the deficit model. We're looking at all the things that went wrong instead of looking at the strengths. And it's usually the strengths that get kids out of trouble. It's usually the strengths that lead to hope and lead to growth. So I think that's probably the most important thing, is if you're looking for ACEs, realize that even families that have had tremendous adversity still have strengths. And those are the things we need to know about, even more so than what's happened to them, because that's going to be our way out.
And I want to touch a little bit. You mentioned racism. I don't know how to say this politely. It's not the act of racism that's so toxic. It's the act of being isolated from the herd that's so toxic. And so having closed down the schools was just as toxic on our children as racism is, because we isolated them from the herd, and we are herd animals. We need to touch and rub against each other and be with each other and tease each other and push each other a little bit. And when you isolate me from the herd, whether it's the playground or because I don't fit in, whatever it is, economically, or for the skin of my color, or where I was born, you feel the same effect of isolation. And that's really my understanding, which is what's so toxic.
Well, yeah. So in that recent AAP policy statement on toxic stress and relational health, there was a whole section on the role and toll of social isolation. So no question that's really important. And there's data to support that too. Matthew Pantel a couple years ago published a study that was basically using almost like an ACE study, but instead of having average childhood experiences, looked at different levels of social isolation. And the more socially isolated you were, it was the worse you're going to do in terms of health outcomes, right? And even going back to the ACE study itself, if you ask Felidia or Anda, who are the two principal leads, what is the toxic part about ACEs? How do ACEs harm you? They'll tell you it's social isolation, it's shame. It's shame. It's this thing that if people knew this about me, then they wouldn't love me anymore. I wouldn't be accepted. If people knew this about me, that my own parents didn't love me enough to whatever, well, then clearly they wouldn't love me either. I mean, it's the social isolation. So there's no question that we are social critters, and that the more we isolate, the worse we're going to do, which is why again the antidote to talk, the policy statement talks about that, that toxic stress helps us understand the problem, right? Even at the molecular, cellular, and behavioral levels, we can understand how adversity sort of gets into you and affects outcomes down the line. So it's a powerful framework for understanding adversity, but it doesn't really point us towards a solution. It's still in the medical model. It's still in the deficits-based realm. It doesn't tell us how we make what we want, how we get things right the first time. And that's where relational health comes in, right? I mean, you can't say you believe in relational health and the fundamental importance for safe, stable, nurturing relationships and think racism's okay. They're incongruent. You can't have that. You can't think that relational health is important and think that discrimination's okay. You can't. And so I think that you're right on with that social isolation is the thing that's most. In fact, I think there actually are studies out there that the thing that triggers the largest stress response from us actually isn't physical pain. It's actually fear of isolation. It's shunning, like being in an Amish and being shunned is what actually is so stressful for human beings. And that probably again goes back to the fact that the reason we're here is we learned how to pack. And if you don't got to pack, you're in trouble. So I think that the social isolation is really toxic for us.
I mean, it's so painful. The famous people have cut their ear off and mailed it. Right. And that's what happens when teenagers get ghosted from the love relationship. They lose it. So it's that isolation that you experience through discrimination or racism or being kept from school or being dumped by a boyfriend or a girlfriend. Very painful.
If we acknowledge that, but that's it. But if we acknowledge that, if we say toxic stress is the problem, but relational health is the solution, then what are we doing to promote relational health? When you start using that relational health lens, I have to warn you, it gets bleak. It gets dark out there
I
right now.
Think so. I don't think so. I think there's a lot of hope ahead. So I wanted to ask you two more questions about this, and then
Sure.
we're going to pivot because I've only talked about the negative stuff because I'm trying to set the floor for us to be optimistic.
Good.
So one thing that I find very difficult is these labels like like SSNR. I keep saying this because I'm very simplistic. I was raised in a Catholic immigrant family. I went to a Catholic primary school, and the rules were very simple. If I complained to the rector about my dad, he would say, "Do what your dad says." If I complained to my dad about the school, he said, "I better not get a call from father because I don't want to deal with that after work." And that was very simple. So I had Father Gatto, and I mean, I'm 56 years old, and I was 11 years old at the time. I still remember his name and went to his funeral, and I got my parents, and, these are very solid relationships. But they used to just be called mom and dad, or it may be mom and mom or dad or mom and an uncle. But that's what we used to have, not SSNR, not SS on NRs. but
Right.
that's what we used to have. And that regrettably does seem like we have lost.
Well, I think so much has changed, right? So much has changed in society. You know what I mean? I mean, it used to be, there was never really a nuclear family, right? It wasn't just mom, dad, and the kids. There were also the aunts, the uncles, the cousins, everyone sort of lived within a couple of blocks of each other, and it was a big kibbutz type thing. I mean, everyone knew each other. That's not the way anymore. It really are there.
No.
These nuclear families are very isolated. And as a consequence, then we're looking for social interaction. So we may get involved in a book club or this sort of thing and that sort of thing. And then you can also see how misinformation gets spread around too, right?
Right.
But the point is, getting back to your idea that, SSNRs, what does that mean? Yeah, safe, stable, and nurturing relationships is just a way of basically saying, always knowing that someone has your back, right? You know what I mean? So yeah, you knew if you got in trouble, you would hear from it, but you also know that they got your back, you know what I mean?
Right.
And they were going to protect you, and you're going to be safe, and they were going to look out for your best interest, and I also hear people saying, well, does that mean you can never get mad as a parent? No, that's not what we're saying. Of course not. I mean, no one can, if you go back to that biobehavioral synchrony, no parent can constantly be in sync with their kid ever. I mean, you can't always be in sync. That's okay, so long as we make the effort to repair. And I think that's the thing that we're losing a lot of, is we're not going back and repairing. We're not saying, I really wasn't listening. I wasn't there for you. I mean, I was angry. I was in my own state, and I'm sorry. And we've lost the ability to repair. It's double down. You know what I mean?
Yes.
And I know what's right, and you can't tell me I'm wrong. And there's no ability to even acknowledge or hear the other, and that gets really complicated from a stress standpoint. If you don't feel like you are in sync with that other person in any way, and there's no way you can come back in sync with them, then that gets toxic. So I think you're right. It's a complicated way of saying something that we sort of took for granted.
Right.
uh,
Right.
but there are a lot of kids right now that don't have that. They really don't
No, and
have that.
and that is a big problem, right? Because I like I told someone the other day, I can't put a pod in the microwave and pop a pediatrician to go help you because you're overwhelmed for the winter. But the same way, I can't pop a pea in the microwave and create a parent or an uncle, or a stable relationship for a kid who's in trouble. Um,
Yeah.
and that's difficult. And some of these families have a lot of stress. They're one parent is in jail, the other one's a drug addict, and grandma is struggling with two kids. When she's too elderly to really have the energy to deal with them.
But you
That's
know what the hope is? The hope is, and going back to what you were saying, you want to end with hope. The
Yes,
hope is the biology. The hope is that even if you've had significant adversity, and even if you may have issues with substance abuse, when you hold that kid in your hands, you're still going to have that, right? And so
yes,
I firmly believe there is a biological drive for parents to connect with their kids. The problem is, as a society, we make it harder and harder for parents to fulfill that drive, right? I mean, it just make it harder and harder based on what's happened to them in their past, not healing from them, never having anyone who taught them how to repair. Do you know what I mean?
yes.
And so I think that the hope is in the biology. We know what's important. We know repair is important. We know social inclusion is important. And so that's the challenge moving forward, is how do we, the Robert Wood Johnson, this big phrase is building a culture of health. Right. And
Correct.
what I think is we really need to build a culture of relational health. You know what I mean?
Yes.
Because I think there is a biological drive there. It's a biological drive. But that doesn't mean it can't be suppressed or usurped by more pressing things.
Correct. And then I just want to touch on this because not every type of stress is toxic stress. We need some stress to grow.
Yeah, so that's it. So, toxic stress is when it's unrelenting and you don't have those social relationships to turn it off. There is positive stress. Positive stress is what motivates us, right? And so stress is a double-edged sword. It can drive you to study for that test tomorrow, or it can make you stay at home in a fetal position, and so the question is, how do we help kids regulate that and understand that? And I think that's really important to point out, is that we're not trying to put kids in a bubble. When we say kids need safe, stable, nurturing relationships, it doesn't mean that we're going to put them in a bubble and never going to have any adversity. That's not what we're talking about. We actually want them to learn how to cope with adversity in a healthy way. There needs to be adversity for them to learn that. But the question is, are we providing them with the skills so they know how to adapt to adversity in a healthy way, right? And that's the challenge. Again, it goes back to the learning. Where does that learning happen? Where's that supposed to happen? Where is affect regulation going to happen? Where it's going to be something that we can, because it's a skill, it's something that can be modeled and practiced and taught and celebrated and learned, just like everything else. And yes, I know some kids will come easy, some will come hard, but if you have trouble in math, we don't say sucks to be you. We actually work on and we help you build those skills. But if you have trouble with your affect regulation, here's your prison cell, right? I mean, we really don't do a very good job of helping kids build those skills.
That's right. And so I think what you said, which I love, is, and I tell parents this in the exam room, when I send you to a psychologist, no different than if you're playing golf and your swing stinks.
Mm-hmm.
I just need
building
someone.
Skills.
I just need somebody to teach you the right skills to be happy, to be in a state of well-being. And it's a coaching process, and it's a growing process, and anybody who's trying to learn a sport or a musical instrument knows that, they need someone to point out how to do things right, because sometimes you get stuck and can't figure it out. That's the optimistic point. And to pivot, because I love when you give your talks, you have the black box. Here comes Herb with all this garbage and baggage and on top of me. And then we go through the black box, and some herbs come out great and some stink, and that's life, right? But that, what's in that black box? What's the pivot? And that, I think, is where the hope and the optimism comes in. And I've heard you say this several times, which really, I like it. I love it. It's about starting to change the way we look. And there's a person in the Cleveland Clinic who does only ADD, Dr. Manus, I think he is.
Mm-hmm.
He's a phenomenal speaker. And he says, pediatricians, business owners, parents, psychologists, we're all just in the business of change management. Our job is to take that little kid that was told something that they did wrong, and they're looking at their past and pivoting, turning him around, turning her around, and see that he or she may be successful in many different ways.
Mm-hmm.
And if you can make that pivot and you can turn that kid around and look into the future, what you're saying, strength-based, not how we think as doctors, but we're not just going to fix the problem. We're going to see this kid flourish and grow. And I think there's very simple ways of doing that, which is sort of fascinating. And it comes all from a science called positive psychology out of UPenn. And so it has to start at the schools, but it's not happening. Because we need to teach the kids to stop, I would say about middle school, to stop and think about the problems and assess the problem. And these are all cognitive skills that you can be taught. It's amazing. I was reading Dr. Gilham's book on Optimistic Child. They can teach you, they can teach teachers. I'm sure they can teach pediatricians. I'm sure they can teach our MAs and our nurses in the office to teach the parents this simple concept of ABC. What's A is for what's the challenge. B, what are your beliefs? If I run into a wall and hit my head really hard, was it just because I'm stupid? I mean, that's my belief, right? And if I continue to think I'm stupid, what's the consequence? Well, I'm going to fail everything in life. Or my belief could be that I'm having a bad day and I was running late for this interview that I really wanted to do with Dr. Gardner. And, I was being absent-minded. There's nothing more than that. And, it's just one of those things that happens. And so I keep going. And her point, which was what you're saying, is you need to teach the parents first.
Yeah.
And then the parent can model and can, at a very early age, start using these very simple cognitive behavioral tools to coach their kids to have an optimistic mind.
Mhm.
The other exercise, which I thought she did fascinating, is the 3 outcomes exercise. So she says, and this is also Marty Seligman. He says, think about what the very, very worst outcome is. Whatever that is, right? You're going to go bankrupt because COVID's here and we can't afford our offices.
Right.
Think about the very, very best outcome. I'm going to win the lottery during COVID. I'm never going to have to practice anymore. I'll just lecture around the world and do philanthropy. That's probably not going to happen. Think about the middle outcome. COVID will pass and, we'll start making money again. And now that you have that, think about what steps get us out of that trap. What steps do I need to start moving in that direction? And what's fascinating is they've replicated this study throughout the world, and they get a huge reduction in child depression by just teaching the teachers to do that. And our school systems are failing us. We're drowning trying to treat kids just to keep them from hurting when we could be teaching this like we teach math and reading in the classroom.
Well, I wholeheartedly agree with you. I mean, what you're talking about is social emotional learning, which for some reason has become a lightning rod for some people. I mean, I cannot think of anything that our kids need more now than social emotional learning, no question. And I think that what you were talking about there, though, that ability to think about this, that is executive function, right? That is prefrontal cortex, right? And that's what we're trying to get to. So what are the things that we need to put in place so kids can have that, right? There's a book by Bruce Perry and Oprah out right now called What Happened to You, right? And so Bruce Perry is a child as a psychiatrist, and he has his neurosequential model. Basically, it says regulate, then relate, then reason. Right. And I think that's the point, is that we're all downstream trying to reason with kids. You need to think this way. You need to think that way. You need to use your prefrontal cortex. You got to turn off that hippocampus. But we got to go upstream and relate to them, right? On an emotional level. We remember that biobehavioral synchrony to turn off that stress response so you can engage that brain. And we got to go even more to regulate ourselves. There's this, like you said, there's this idea of in home visiting of parallel process, right? If we and as a child professional can interact with a caregiver and in a way that nurtures a relationship, then hopefully that's going to get translated into the way they interact with their child. But what you were talking about there in terms of, I think of as narratives, right? The narratives that kids play in their heads, you're right. Where do those narratives come from? At this point, we're not really teaching them positive narratives. We're pointing out all the negative narratives. We're doing a really good job of pointing out how everything's wrong. Right. But really not pointing out what's right, And so I think that goes back again to the fact that we're sort of embedded in the medical model, which is very deficits based. And primary care pediatrics and raising kids is not about what's wrong with you. It's about what's strong with you and how we can partner you to get that environment right to optimize outcomes. And that's a different perspective. And then that's why I think as pediatricians we struggle. I think that's why we have moral injury, because we start slowly over time start to realize this system really is not designed to do what it says it's going to do, right? This system is really not designed to keep people healthy and optimize outcomes down the line. And in fact, it's incentivized to do the exact opposite. And so that is the frustration I think we're up against, is that we know the importance of positive narratives. We know the importance of positive relationships. We know the importance of social connection, but we're in a system that doesn't value that. We're only pointing out what's broken.
And to your other point, which you've mentioned several times today, is their program works because they teach the teachers and they teach the parents how to model that behavior so
Yeah,
that even though the child's frontal lobe's not fully developed, they're sinking and they're not, the mother or the father is not going haywire and the kid's seeing, oh, okay, so when I have a problem, this is what I'm supposed to do. I'm supposed to
right,
stop and think. Okay.
right.
All right. That's what mom does. That's what dad does. I don't just start screaming. Okay. Got it. And so
Or
that,
hitting,
or
or right,
hitting or
exactly.
throwing things or grab the bottle of
Right.
whiskey and chug it, whatever that dysfunctional behavior is. And if
But
we
that's a
could,
coping mechanism. That's the thing that's important to remember. I mean, that was the coping mechanism that adult developed for
yes,
a reason. So we tend to look at them and say, well, they're broken, they're the problem. No one taught them how to do it either, right?
no,
And
no.
so
So,
so
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 it's,
that's an important thing. So we got to make sure, again, we're not having implicit bias of who we're blaming. It's not the kids, it's not the parent. It really is the milieu that we're raising kids in. And are we able to repair and get back to being in sync?
well,
Now, I
they've been,
I have a question. This is all fascinating. All right. I guess we can find people that are broken, problems, toxic stress, and all this kind of stuff. We see them in a room. Who's supposed to fix this? What
Yeah, so
profession?
society.
What profession is supposed to fix this?
I'm so sorry, I didn't hear you say that again.
What profession is supposed to fix this problem?
That's a great question. And the policy statement addresses that, and it says there isn't one. It's going to take a team, right? There's basically what the policy statement says is we need a public health approach. So a public health approach means that we need to do universal primary preventions. We got to do a better job of getting things right the first time. We got to identify potential barriers at the societal level that keep families from being the best versions of themselves. And then, yeah, we still need treatment. We still need treatment. I mean, let's face it, the way we've tended to approach the mental health crisis in this country is by saying we need more challenge to psychiatrists. And an analogy would be to say, geez, we have all these kids that are getting shot. Let's make more surgeons. You know what I mean? No, we actually have to do a better job of preventing kids from meeting them in the first place, right? No, I'm not saying we don't need more providers. We do, right? There's no question we do. We need more providers. We need to identify those barriers and do a better job, but we can't do it ourselves. And so that's why public health approach is not integrated just vertically, it's also horizontally across systems. Clearly, we need co-location of mental health providers. We need psychologists. We need social workers in our clinics. And we need access to programs like Health Leads, where we can meet families where they are and make sure that they are getting the food that they need, make sure that they do have housing, those basic things. Because if the family's in survival, if the parents are in survival mode, it's not likely the parents are regulating and being able to do a good job of helping their kids learn how to regulate, right? And so yeah, it's not something that one profession is going to do, but I think that it has to start with us because we have longitudinal experiences with families. We have trusting relationships with families so we can find out where they are and what their most pressing needs are at the moment. And so do I think that we can solve this on our own? Of course not. No, we can't. But we are pretty good advocates too, right? I mean, we are advocates for children and their families more so than we are for our wallets. It's always been the issue with pediatricians. Right? I mean, we've always been valued advocates in DC and in state houses across the country because we've been trusted advocates for kids and their families, that we had their best interests at heart. And so that is a mantle we should take up and say, we are failing our kids. We're failing families. We are not providing them with the things that they need. We are not allowing families to fulfill their biological potential, the parents included, in terms of being able to bond with their kids and be the best versions of themselves. So I totally hear where you're coming from. There's no way we can do it all, but I think unless we try and break out of the deficits mold, we're going to increasingly talk about all the problems and not do anything to get towards the solutions. And so I think that's the point, is we want to try and start thinking at least a little bit about how do we get there? How do we get towards some solutions?
Right. So I think, I mean, I do all these surveys and screenings, and I find people all day long, and I send them somewhere. The usual answer is, well, nobody takes insurance, or I can't get in, or nobody wants to pay for it. I mean, I think if you think that we need to send them to mental health providers, insurance, Medicare, Medicaid should cover these services, yet they don't. And if they don't, then the commercials don't.
Yeah.
We just keep spinning wheels.
Yeah, no, I wholeheartedly agree with your frustration, and I think that's part of the problem is that the healthcare, insurance, industrial complex, that whole thing that we are just a tiny little piece of inside there, has basically said we are going to incentivize and pay for what's wrong with you and what we did to you. Right, and we're not really going to do a better job of trying to keep people from getting sick and needing more services down the line anyway. So I think it's a short sort of, we're stuck here and we're not thinking about where we need to get to, right? And so I hear you. We need to do a better job of actually having those resources available for families that need them. But I would also say that even if you don't have all those resources there, you can still make a big impact through that common factors approach, which is something the Academy talks about a lot, which is the common factors being what are the things, regardless of what sort of therapy you use, whether it's cognitive behavioral therapy or interpersonal therapy or even psychoanalysis, what are the factors that tend to be most correlated with outcomes being positive and change, as Dr. Bravo was saying before, what correlates with change? It's the therapeutic relationship. By being understanding and hearing where they're at, by being sympathetic, by having sync with the caregiver, by being hopeful, by saying, I can't fix this for you, but I hear where you're at, and don't be afraid to ask for help in the future. That's the best way we move forward. So believe me, I share your frustration. That's part of the reason that I do what I do, is that every day you feel like you're, again, you feel like you're on like you said, round and round. You feel like you're a gerbil in a hamster wheel, right?
Let me tell you a positive experience that we had with some mental health. We were involved with some hospital thing where they embedded in our office and social work to provide them mental health and all that. Very quickly, she had a lot of patients. Very quickly.
Yeah.
Gave soft handoffs when she was there, was able to get in, and she did therapy and so forth. Then I guess COVID came, and then things happened. They were supposed to be billing somebody, and then I guess they couldn't make enough money. I don't know how, but they couldn't make enough money. Okay, so what did they do? They pulled the plug on the whole program.
Yeah.
And then, everybody's private pay. A lot of the people that have adversity and have toxic stress, what don't they have? Is private pay. So we just keep spinning wheels. It's silly.
Well, yeah, so you're right. And so that's the thing is, if, I love this quote. There's a quote from Buckminster Fuller, who said, you never change things by fighting the existing reality. To change things, build a new system that makes the old system obsolete. And I think that's the problem, right? I mean, we're, again, this little bit inside this whole system that's so broken. How do we show that as primary care pediatricians, if we are doing a job of bonding with the parents and the caregivers, then we're in a position that they, again, sort of the same sort of thing I was talking about before, regulate, relate, and reason. If the family senses that we have implicit bias and we're not regulated and we're sort of angry with them, done. We have no hope for changing that family, right? And then if we can relate to them where they're at, and even if we can't fix the fact that they're hungry or have food insecurity, but at least acknowledge it and we can have that emotional connection, then maybe we're going to take them out of survival mode and get them into relational mode where they can then learn some adaptive skills to help with their child. So like Dr. Bravo was saying before, it's about change. How do we bring about change? How do we bring about what Dr. Perry said was a reason? I don't see it as really reason. It's about growth. How do we bring about reason, growth, skill formation, building new skills? How do we bring about hope? We're not going to get to that level unless we have the relational component and the affect regulation to start with. Yeah.
Well,
so I share your frustration, but I think I don't know how we get out of our broken cycle unless we start thinking about, again, we know what's broken. How do we get to where we want to be?
I'll go back to what Jim's a partner with George, and he does a lot of obesity, and he says, I can help 60% of the kids. The other 30% don't want to change. And I got to focus on the ones that I can help. And the other thing he says is start early. So they send a video to all their patients at 4 months that says, no juices. This is a healthy diet. Because once you get hooked on the juices, you're going to gain weight and you're going to be dependent on that sugar. And so I think that if we take the teachings of people like Dr. Gilham and Marty about teaching the ABCs to parents early on and reinforcing it so that they can be well themselves, we might be able to move the needle in some of these kids. I might not be able to take them out of poverty, but I might be able to make their parents a little more effective. I also think that if we, to your point that you've made many times, if you go onto the Authentic Happiness website, we could measure in kids already their authentic strengths. And so we're looking at the future as opposed to measuring the ACEs, which is looking at their past. And that's a simple intervention that a parent could do at home with a computer and then bring it in. Yeah, we don't get to charge for it, but at least it gets them thinking about positive things. This is what my child is like. This is what I'm like. This is maybe why we have some friction, because I'm about learning and he's about something else. And those things we can do. Well, just because we're taking too much of your time, but one thought that just crossed my brain is, how can cognitive behavioral therapy work in children when we're trying to deal with the cognition and their frontal lobe's not developed yet?
Yeah, so I think that that it's not completely developed, but it's still there.
Okay.
And again, if we've got regulation and we've got relation, then they are able to reason. They are able to make good decisions, right? So that's why no kid's going to learn something when they're in the midst of a tantrum. You know what I mean? It's not going to happen. But what my simplistic way of the teaching cognitive behavioral therapy, and I don't know if this is helpful to anyone but me, but is I try and think about the fact that there's three things we look at. We look at behavior, and then there's emotion, and then there are the thoughts that drive that. And so we as parents, particularly when kids are young and caregivers, we're focused entirely on the behavior. Stop doing this, stop. You know, that really doesn't help a kid very much. You can't teach a stop, but you can go upstream and help them understand the emotion that's driving that. I understand your brother's making you crazy, but we don't hit, you know, and I understand you're angry. And so we're labeling that emotion for them. And then as they get older, and I'm not talking terribly old, 4 or 5 years old, we can say, label that emotion. There's nothing wrong with the emotion, which is part of the problem, is that we let kids know in a million different ways, you're not allowed to feel that way. You're not allowed to be that way. That's really harmful, right? There's nothing wrong with emotion. You're allowed to feel whatever you want, and that's part of being human, because if you can't feel the bad stuff, you can't feel the good stuff. So it's okay to have those bad negative emotions. But then we need to go upstream even further and begin identifying those narratives, those thought patterns that lead to those emotions, right? And help kids understand. So in my practice, I spend a lot of time talking, an inordinate amount of time talking about passions. What brings you joy? What do you love to do? Because basically, when you have one of those big emotions, you need a distraction. You need something else to think about. But there's sort of three different buckets of distractions. Some distractions build skills and make you a better person, and that's what we want to focus on. Some distractions are just an escape. So the kids do YouTube, Netflix, video games, computers for a reason. It's a distraction. It's not really making a better person, but it's a distraction. And if we don't get those right, then when kids get in adolescence, they will find those behavioral allostasis things we talked about, smoking, drooling, promiscuity. They will cope in a maladaptive manner. And so I that's the buckets I think of. You've got behavior, try not to focus on the behavior, try and understand the emotion that's driving that behavior. And then if we have that, then let's help them understand there's nothing wrong with that emotion, but geez, let's find some healthy distractions, things that you can put that emotional energy into. So if a kid learns every time the brother makes him mad, his response is to go draw a picture or to play the piano, well, now he's Van Gogh or he's Beethoven, because he's taken all that emotional energy and channeled something constructive. So I think that's my simplistic way of doing cognitive behavioral therapy in little kids. Is it is okay to have the emotion. Stop focusing on the behavior. Let's build some skills by taking that emotional energy and channeling something constructive.
That's wonderful. And then one last question, because I read this in a book on anxiety, and it was very interesting to me. It was a like PhD, or it was a therapist, and she said, stay away obviously from Xanax because it numbs your amygdala, but it makes you an addict. Doesn't resolve anything. which is totally true. I mean, there
Yeah.
are very few times in the emergency room where you need to use Xanax or
Right.
Ativan acutely. But you also made a claim, which I don't know if it's true. She said Lexapro helps rebuild the neuronal pathways in combination with cognitive behavioral therapy. That involve it's part of the neuroplasticity. So
Yeah.
the serotonin being there kind of helps create the new pathways, so you get out of the rumination and the worrying. And I don't know if you read that before, you think that's a valid thought.
Well, I think we're still. I mean, I think there are some studies out there that suggest, and I can't come up with the specific ones now, but there are some studies out there that suggest that serotonin is important for plasticity, and there are examples out there where using SSRIs will increase plasticity and promote learning of and that sort of thing, like unlearning. I'm trying to remember. I think it was actually unlearning habituation or something like that. There was an example of that. So I think there is some data out there but I think part of the problem with all those medicines is we're bathing the brain in it. Do you know what I mean? It's not like we're really zeroing in, we're not targeting in on those sorts of things. You know what I mean? So again, so I think it gets really complicated, and I think that as we 100 years from now, things are going to look very different in terms of our ability to stimulate specific cells and different patterns and that sort of thing. But I wanted to say one thing you mentioned before, which was, we can't bring every kid out of poverty. And I think that's true. And I'm not sure that's really what our goal is. I mean, clearly that'd be great in a utopia, but I think what we can do is make sure that poverty is not toxic. And I think that's the point with toxic stress, is that the thing that makes it toxic is the lack of those social emotional supports. I often give talks and people will say, I grew up in the depression, not so much now, but when I grew up in the depression, we didn't have a bowl to urinate in, and we did just fine. Yeah, but everyone was in it together. Right? Everyone was in it together. There wasn't that social isolation. It wasn't the disparities that was so toxic. So whether it's poverty or racism or all those things, no question, we want to try and limit the exposure to those. But like the pandemic's a good example. We can't put kids in a bubble. We can't prevent a once in a lifetime pandemic, but we certainly can make sure it's not as toxic. Right? We can surely make sure it's not as toxic by making sure we have those relational supports there. So they learn how to adapt in a healthy manner. They learn that, for me, I feel when my brother's making me crazy or there's a pandemic comes around, I feel better when I go for a run, when I play the piano. I'm building resilience then, and so just saying, well, hope you figure it out. Best of luck, and too bad you picked marijuana. Right? I mean, that's pretty much what we're doing at this point.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Well, so I told you I wanted to end up in an optimistic note. I think that with all the work you've done at the academy, and the work that Marty Seligman's been doing with just exactly what you're saying, let's pivot. Let's look at strengths. Let's stop looking at just what makes you short and what you can do with a short body. I mean, you can still, there's lots of careers where you don't have to be tall.
You be a
Right.
jockey. I don't want to be a jockey.
Right.
Right.
So there's tremendous hope. I think science is moving in that direction, and more than ever in a rapid direction, to move to look at strengths in people and try to uplift them as opposed to just label them with deficiencies. And I thank you very much for the work you're doing in that direction, because it's very important. And I think we will get there. It's going to be a tough haul, but we're going to get there. And I thank you for your time. It's been a real pleasure to have this time with you today.
Sure. Thanks for having me, and good to see both of you.
All right. Hopefully we'll see you soon.
All righty.
All right.